Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to our last Friday Fireside Chat of 2021. So very delighted to have you all with us. A couple of quick reminders. This is being recorded, so don't say anything you don't want, the New York Times to find out about. I'm Rita McGrath, and my guest this week is Chris Ategeka, who is many things, which I hope we'll be able to dive into, but most recently the author of a pretty new book called The Unintended Consequences of Technology, which is just an absolutely fascinating sort of trip through history and capitalism and causation and why things are the way that they are. So Chris, welcome. Thank you for making the time for us.
Thank you, Rita. Thank you for having me.
It's a real pleasure. So let's start with your own story, because I think that's a really fascinating tale. To go from really desperate circumstances in Uganda to doing what you're doing now. Maybe just fill our listeners in on where you came from and how you got to be where you are.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. So I grew up in rural Uganda. I lost my parents early on when I was a kid, and I went through all the effects of extreme poverty. And over time, at around age 15, I came across a nonprofit that helps kids who have lost parents to go to school, just a typical sponsor and orphan type of program. And they sponsored me to go to school. And the way that program works, they match an orphan in Africa with a donor in Europe or America. And that donor sends $25 a month and support a kid and hope their life is better. So I was that kid. And the important part of that story that's really related to the book is that there's this component about us humans, the compassion, the love, the empathy that, we can talk about later, but the idea that those things that make us truly human are very, very hard to translate in our algorithmic lifestyles. So as we create algorithms, it's about data, and data can be good, data can be bad, trash in, trash out. So that's one component about my, the beginning of my life story that has carried me through to really want to write something about technology.
And so you went to Berkeley.
I went to UC Berkeley Engineering School, undergrad and graduate school. And from there, just became an entrepreneur, started building companies in Silicon Valley, and kind of, learned from the inside how the sausage is made. And, it got me to this point where after my last, successful event, I decided I needed to tackle my next project, and that was writing a book.
Great. And that's part of the UCOT. Is it a foundation or an
No,
institution?
UCOT is actually a company centered around two premises. One is think about like TED Talks, but everything we talk about at this TED Talk event is about how technology may not be serving humanity's best interests and what we can do about it. So it's a convening that brings people together to talk about unintended consequences of technology. And then in addition to that, anybody can stand on a platform and tell you the house is on fire. So what are you really doing about that? And we have another component to it about coming up with solutions to the things that are already going bad. So being reactive, and also proactive measures to start thinking about solutions for things that might go bad that we know are on the way.
That's really interesting. And how long have you had that operation in business?
5 years.
Oh, 5 years. Okay. So you got a bit of a track record now to kind of look back on. That's great. So in the book, you really start off with capitalism, both the history of it and kind of where we are now with it. And, the really, I think a lot of people are coming to recognize that it's at the moment very broken. The manifestations of capitalism are very broken. We've got incredible monopoly power among certain firms, inequality that is just very hard to get your head around, all these negative externalities. And at the bottom, right, this sort of starvation wages, jobs that need to be subsidized by the government because people don't make enough basic income to meet their most simple needs. And you warn us that humanity could end up like MySpace. So maybe if you could expand on that a little, because that's the first time I've heard that one.
I want to kind of point out the fact that capitalism is actually not broken. It's working too well. It's actually perfected to work exactly how it was designed to work. It was optimized, and it is optimized. And we continue to live in this world. It's a trance. It's the trance of comfort. It's a trance of growth. It's a trance of financial maximization, and it's working. If someone can have $300 billion as net worth as one person, you can't say that system is broken. It's really doing its job. But as a consequence, there are these other negative externalities that come with that. So the wealthy folks from the early 20th century were mostly centered around extraction of things from underground. And those are the people who made a lot of money, and they were the most influential people. Even to this day, we still call them philanthropists. And today, the extraction has moved from underground, even though the underground extraction is still going on, and the extraction of our resources is also still going on. It's the extraction of our attention. And that's what's creating the new money. So if you look at an orange and you're making juice, you can only squeeze juice out of the orange so much. At some point, it will be not an orange anymore. And that's where we're at. The way innovation is working today, we are on a path to potentially innovate ourselves into extinction. But because that's such an uncomfortable truth, we don't want to hear it. We don't want to talk about it. So anyways, that's kind of what I mentioned in the book about all the negative externalities and the things that are going on in our world today that we consider unpleasant, from climate change and these other things, like floods and tornadoes, and all the world seems to be in constant chaos. All those externalities are, if you look at our manufacturing, our extraction, our push for financial maximization at the expense of everything else. It's not that capitalism is not working. It's more that it's working too well. And it's the misalignment of incentive structures that's putting us in this place. And the idea that a tree has value only after it's cut down, that mindset is what needs to change. And looking at ourselves at the peak, at the apex of this, existence on planet Earth, and not looking at other things like giving rights to nature, for instance, as an incentive structure. So it's all about, let's make all the dollars, but at some point, that incentive, because of the path we're taking, that incentive will have to shift.
When you make you observe in the book that a lot of these ecological policies, people come back and say, oh, well, it's a job destroyer. But you make the point, if we destroy the planet, that's not good for jobs either.
A dead planet is a terrible place to run a business.
I recall a cartoon which showed two planets talking to each other, in a cartoon world. And one is beautiful and blue, and it really looks great. And the other one is just brown and, groggy looking. And the first planet says to the second one, well, what happened to you? And he said, oh, I got Homo sapiens. And the first planet says, oh, don't worry, they don't last long.
Yeah, I don't know if you saw this little video at the UN when the dinosaur came in and gave a speech. There's a cool marketing video that was, I don't know if it was fiction or was in real life, but a dinosaur came in and gave a speech. It's like, listen up, people, let me tell you something. I know a thing or two about extinction. It's a very funny video. You should find it. So,
I'll have to look it up. Absolutely. Yeah, that's great. Yeah. That's great. So one of the counter arguments that gets made to, well, not counter arguments, I wouldn't say, but one of the narratives that gets told about how capitalism evolves is by someone I quite admire called Carlota Perez. And her thesis is that great leaps forward in technology. So the Industrial Revolution, the invention of mass transportation via railroads and canals, that it has this pattern of production capital flowing into investment capital, creating bubbles, which many have argued we're in the middle of a huge bubble right now, creating these bubbles, but that then creates the infrastructure upon which the next layer of productivity growth occurs, and that then can, if we manage it properly, lead to a new golden age. And she cites inequality in the bubble stage as one of the sort of characteristics, but then once the bubble has passed, the investment capital goes back into production capital, and that can lead, again, if managed properly, to broadly shared prosperity, which I think is, when I get really depressed sort of the current state of capitalism, I kind of like to look at that view of the world and think, well, maybe there is a next game coming up.
It is the key word is if managed properly, right there. Any movie, any story, any book you've read, you will realize there are very, very few that are written in the contrary. Any book you read, any movie you watch, there's always this story arc. There's a villain, and then there's a hero, and they fight, and you're like, oh, the hero is gonna go, and then the villain always comes in, and at the end of the story, in order to leave you feeling high and feeling good about watching this movie, the hero, the person you are rooting for, eventually wins. Mm-hmm. What I'm saying is, like, I'm not saying capitalism is 100% bad. I'm not saying technology is 100% bad. Like,
you're very balanced in the book.
Yeah, and everything is on a spectrum. It's not all good, it's not all bad, but it's just the idea that we need to sit with this uncomfortable truth, that those two truths can actually coexist in the same domain. And the people who are pro whatever the thing is, capitalism, technology, they want to push for the idea, like, but when you talk about technology is breaking democracy, but that is the idea is like you want to put a blind eye toward where it may not be serving humanity's best interest because you want to push an agenda that technology is actually good. The same with capitalism. But the reality is it's not either good or bad. It's just that these two components, they coexist, and how can we address them? My only concern, not my only concern, but one of their concerns is the idea that there's so much incentives, trillions of dollars going toward the development, the push for hopeful prosperity, this utopia that we're going for, this optimization that we're pushing for. And then there's not a whole lot of resources and research and data that's coming out on the other side, because the incentive structures there are not as the same as the ones in the innovation. Let's break things and we'll fix them when they break later. So there's not a whole lot of money going towards let's fix the things that are actually breaking, or let's stop things from breaking in the first place. So that misalignment is what puts us in this place where we find ourselves just staying in the hopeful phase and putting a blind eye to the venom.
Mm, mm. And you make the point that many of the things that are really human, I'll call them social goods, education, healthcare, housing, a clean environment, so many of those things actually don't have advocates, at least not advocates with, financial power. And that's where capitalism breaks down, right? When you've got a cost that's broadly borne and a benefit that's narrowly focused, that tends to have just that kind of incentive structure you're talking about.
And if we were to do a poll, even with the crowd right here that we have, and ask what's the most important thing to you as an individual, you'll hear things like my health, my family, my children, my this, that, or the other. And those things are the things we think we value the most is the places we put the least investments. We only put there things that are donations. We donate a little bit of money to a children's hospital, just like there's an excess that we have, but we will happily put $100 million in some app. Hopefully it will give us a 10x. So we put 100 million over here and we put 10,000 over here, but the 10,000 is a place of the things we say we care the most about, which is an interesting, Brian psychology.
Yeah, it is. When you put it like that, it's an interesting disconnect that the things that are really human are not getting the investment, at least in America and in much of Europe, although you do make an exception for the Nordic countries, that they seem to have that balance a little bit better than we seem to have.
And they report highest happiness index.
Mm-hmm. So is your thought then that we could import some of that? I mean, the way that the Nordics would frame it would be, pretty high taxes, pretty high marginal tax rates, pretty strict controls on what companies can and cannot do with respect to the environment. Pretty, lots of public goods. So subsidized healthcare, subsidized childcare, subsidized, housing in some cases. For example, in Finland, they've taken homelessness on as a national priority. And they've said, we're not going to have homeless people here. We're going to find a place for them, which is, not just housing, but also all the supporting infrastructure that you need if you became homeless in the first place. And so just some really interesting examples of things that do work.
So what I've learned is we have a big globe, a globe that has borders, and the borders that contain unique cultures that inform the development or the lack thereof of that specific group or that specific country. So importing what's working in over there to over here, from here to over there, is what colonialism did, and it failed really bad.
Yeah, that's true.
Is the idea that you take a thing from here that's working really well and you bring it over here and it's going to work. The one thing that has really has struck me as I was doing research and writing this book is the idea that technology is this one thing that actually has figured out how to cross borders and have an impact over there without having to move physical goods or physical people. Just the idea that technology can skip over the rules and over the boundaries that borders have put in place. So if you look at, let's say the word ethics in technology. So the question is, can we have, if technology, if built here in the United States or built over there in China or over there in Russia, whatever the country it's built, but that technology can't be contained within a country and it ends up leaping and going to another country and having a significant impact in that country, if we ask the question, can we have a universal ethics that applies to technology because now the technology itself is universal? And the answer is potentially maybe no. we may not be able to have a universal ethics, because what is right over here may not be right over here. What we value over here may not be valued over there. And we're trying to force this globalized technology to fit some sort of a mold. And it goes back like, we'll come over here and we'll give you democracy, damn sure you need democracy. And then it doesn't work, because in that society, they have a different set of rules. So it's the kind of same mindset we need to take, that we have a different set of circumstances that, for me, the word if you take the letter W, and it's so the word, if you put a mirror and you put letters M and E on top of it, and you look in it, you'll see it turns into we. So we need to go from me to we. I think what's bringing us into this place is the idea that we are so self-centered, to each their own kind of mindset, that it's kind of, we've lost what it means to be a community that relies on each other. We've lost the interconnectedness of the systems. It's all about what I can get for me. And then whatever I get, I'm the best person who knows where I need to apply it. I either go into another planet, or go to the deepest parts of the sea, or stay here and do whatever I can and want to, because it's my resources.
Yeah, there's a very interesting set of discussions, some 4 or 5 months ago, when the New York Times ran a big expose on how much the wealthiest people in the country actually paid in taxes, and it was infinitesimally small, right? I mean, less than many of the people that work for them, I guess, would be. To which one of these folks actually responded. He said, "Well, I actually think I know better where to put my money, in terms of investment and what things I'm trying to solve." And of course, that's not how government and society and democracy work, right? It's like, you're part of this whole system. You should be prepared to pay into it, And I thought that was just such a revealing mindset.
And if you look at chapter 2 of the book, what tech, state, and nation.
I was going to raise that next.
It's exactly that. Go ahead. Sorry. Yeah.
No, I was going to ask you about that, because you make a fascinating analogy in the book that a lot of these big tech companies, that the nearest analogy to how they relate to their users is to like drug dealers or pimps. I thought that was super interesting. I've not seen that before.
But that's true. It's the idea that a pimp knows how many tricks one of the workers can turn, and how long they can stay on the street. And as soon as they run out of gas, they kick them to the curb, and they find another one who's ready to take the job. You look at any tech company, that's how it goes. If you don't have a break to go to the bathroom and you have to go in a bottle, it's just that the idea that is another 10,000 people in line waiting to take your job. If you don't want it, you can leave. So it's like, that mindset is all about extracting. How much can I get out of you? What's in for me kind of mindset is part of the problem.
Mm-hmm. And you talk about the tech companies actually having more power in many cases than the nation states, sort of. The citizens of Facebook are more numerous than the citizens of many countries.
Yeah, so you find that a country has a bunch of citizens who start very powerful tech companies, and these tech companies have a bigger populace than the said country where the founders come from. And even if that same country where they come from decides, we're going to ban this technology, we don't want to be, on it at all, this technology will continue to thrive and be profitable elsewhere without the need of the population of the country where they're from. So imagine the dilemma of the politicians trying to regulate a company that they do not have power over, or the idea that this exponential nature of our technology growth, that policy is trailing, understanding what's being built is trailing. So if you bring in somebody to testify in front of Congress and you don't understand what they're building, they already have an upper hand. And
So,
that's kind of the place we find ourselves in.
yeah. So how do you make money again? Someone, I forget who it was, but one of the Congress people asked,
So like,
and he says, we sell ads. It was just
and
like
he
the
did
understatement of the century.
he did it in such like a stoic image, like, senator, we sell ads.
Yeah, t-shirts made with that on it. I think I read that somewhere. But I do think you're right. And this is one of the fundamental problems of institutions, that there's often a 15 to 20 year lag between the time something becomes technologically or commercially or manifest in real life, and there's an institutional response that meets it. And we saw this in the early days of the 20th century with, as you said, with the extractive industries, the big steel industries, the big oil companies. And it took, 20 years for governments to realize that these were monopolies and that they were not being run for the greater good, and they were actually broken up. But, I want to come back to this notion of nation states, because you and I had a conversation some time ago about the different motivations of like tech companies in the West versus, say, in China. And you use the example of Jack Ma as someone who at one point was this like heroic figure in China. And now, he's really being, I guess, what would you say, suppressed or put down by the government. They're kind of very deliberately taking away a lot of the power that he accumulated.
Yeah, no. So what I came to a realization in the book is that there are two worlds that are going on right now as we're building technologies. So I use two examples. The first example is around AI, and then the second example is about biological systems. Mm-hmm. So the first example, let's take AI as an example. In the West, we are building to maximize, let's make a buck quick, okay? Let's go and create that trillion, multi-trillion dollar company the quickest way we can get there. That's some form of power. That's some form of control that we are creating. So if you look at Europe and America, the West is mostly centered around that. And the people who are able to build that, they're heroes. They're put on a pedestal. They're put on the front pages of magazines, and everybody's aspiring to be that. Okay, so that's the Western incentive of building the new technology companies. If you look at countries like China and others in that authoritarian, dictatorial domain, you'll find that in that world, the tech that's being built, again, we're still with AI, is the control of the mind type of tech. And in that world, don't get me wrong, we will make the money, the money making is the fun part, but you can't make too much, and it's the control of the populace that's the biggest incentive structure. It's more like a religion where the leaders so much believe in the religion, the doctrine, the thing they're trying to impose on the populace, that they're willing to die on that hill to make sure that they can control the populace. And if you make a lot of money, i.e. Jack Ma or anybody in that system, and you tend to kind of slowly rise above that power that might be, the power will do anything and everything to try to suppress you. In the West, on the other hand, you do anything and everything to give that person the attention they need and deserve so that you can raise more of such type people. So that's an AI mindset. Mm-hmm. So if we take the biological systems mindset, you'll find that we're building two worlds again. There's the world of the haves and the world of the have-nots. The world of the have, so I'll take vaccine as an example. I'm double, triple shot, and I could go get one extra if I needed one. And there's a whole subset of the world population in the global South who haven't even seen their first. Okay. it's not that the world lacks the vaccine. There isn't an incentive to actually figure out how we get that vaccine there, the logistics of getting that vaccine there. So what does that create? It creates a world where you have people like you and I who have a healthy body, and we're able to use this newfound technology to, catch things. We can proactively sequence things and understand our bodies and live longer. And then there's this other subset that doesn't have that access. If we go even farther, 50, 100 years from now, when we're able to implant chips in our brains and download books into our brains and download our thoughts, in such a way, then as you can imagine, in that cyborg world, you'll find that there's a whole world of people in the haves world that is enhanced, have higher capabilities, because they have access to this technology. And then there's a whole kind of like subpart population because they don't have that enhancement. So, and those two worlds are going on right now. And we never know on where that will take us. It's just time, will tell.
That's really interesting. One of our most loyal listeners, Frank Calbert, wants to know, do you see prospects for genuine collaboration among parties with more or less equal standing? Humans do tend to sort themselves into hierarchies. Leaders tend to emerge, even if, temporarily, and we tend to have some kind of status hierarchy in almost all societies. Some are larger than others. Do you see examples of collaboration that might be a template that we could turn to?
So I was born in Africa, in East Africa. And I will also venture off to say most of Africa and South America and some parts of Southeast Asia and that part of the world, you find that there is this system around, it's what we value. It's the incentive structures. What do we really value? Is me being the most prosperous person as an individual, have all the things I could ever need, but still be sad and depressed in my castle, making it to the top. I'm very, very cold at the top because I'm alone and I didn't bring anybody with me, or bring people along. So an example I wanted to give is that in the other way of life, which is the we kind of life, is that I can't be too mad at my neighbor for too long. And the reason is that I need my neighbor tomorrow to borrow something. I need my neighbor to help me when I have a family member who's sick. I need my neighbor to show up when I need to celebrate a win. And in that case, in that culture, you find that that those folks tend to want to keep the collaboration going for so many reasons, taking care of each other and know the value of interconnectedness. And someone would say, well, if those systems can work and they are, possibly prosperous, why is that those people are not as successful as you would put it in GDP and all these other values that we use in the West to measure success? And to that, I would say, is the measure of GDP the only measure of success? Right? I grew up wearing like ragged shorts and, with holes in them and no shoes. And in that environment, before the world showed me what else is possible, I never really knew what I was missing. The world was fine because that's all I knew. So again, it goes back to the idea that we need to shift the incentive structures of what success metric is.
Mm-hmm. I think that's such a powerful idea. I'm reminded of William Baumol, who was an economist at NYU and other places. And he said, if you want to think about where entrepreneurial energy goes in a society, assuming you have roughly the same innate population of people with entrepreneurial tendencies, it can be productive. So it creates value, it contributes in some way, it can be unproductive. And he would put most financial services as unproductive. You're just taking value that's already been created and kind of moving the resources around, or it can be destructive. And what he talks about there is, criminal enterprises or corruption or bribery, or, if you don't have the right incentives, and that's the only way people can get on with life, that's what they'll do, which is kind of analogous to your analogy about the tech companies. They're doing things that, and consciously, and this is what I find very disturbing, consciously doing things that they know are harmful to people, and yet they have no incentive not to do that.
No, but it's the final incentive that's really empowering to keep doing it. Mm-hmm. And that is this CSR mindset, where you can go into a village, extract oil, create cancer around the village, and then make multi-billion dollars, come back and build a hospital, call yourself a philanthropist, and then the world praises you for being a philanthropist. Mm-hmm. So the gap between, there's a time lag between the awful act and then you eventually celebrate it. So I can take the hit in the meantime, but I eventually buy myself a slice of heaven. So that mindset is kind of what's keeping the incentive going for people to create things they know are intentionally harmful, but they can redeem themselves later.
So the short-term gain outweighs the longer-term structures. So in the book, and I know we won't have time to go through each of these, but you talk about the data industrial complex and the unintended consequences of things like data bias, privacy, which I've written about as well. The idea of political manipulation, social spillovers. I mean, there just seems to be a lot. Then AI, treating human beings like drug users, almost keeping them addicted. It's an interesting analogy to that is the tobacco companies, right? That for years said, oh, no, light cigarettes are not going to hurt you. Well, that turned out to be completely untrue. Genomics, the sort of new Cold War, gaps of trust, cyber warfare, lots of work. I mean, there's just, I'll do my Vanna White thing here. Great book, Unintended Consequences of Technology. So what I think people often land on when they even contemplate these things, if they contemplate them at all, is almost a sense of there's nothing we can do. And I think in the book and in your is it a foundation in your organization, you've said, well, that's not actually true. So for example, with climate change, there's 5 things that we can actually focus on. So stopping plankton decline, limiting the use of fossil fuels, stop clear-cutting forests, promote diversity of plant health, and limit carbon in the atmosphere. And what I like about that list is each one of those things is very specific, and you could do something about each one of those things. So you talk about, as individuals, what can we do? And you talk about voting. And I thought maybe that would be something to spend a little time on. How can individuals take some kind of action?
Yeah, thank you. Great question. So our monkey brain that we've evolved into from over the years is that when we are faced with a threat, any threat, it's the 3 Fs, right? Fight, flight, or freeze. And each one of us has some form of response in one of those 3. The big complex world problems at the moment, you can see yourself and just freeze. It's just too big. It's like, who am I? What can I do? What is my contribution gonna do? Yeah. And to that, I say that your small contribution and my small contribution, if it sums up at the end, the sum of those parts can actually equal to a larger impact. If you just focus on your small contribution, the bad place to be is to freeze entirely and not do anything, because if you're not on the table, you are on the menu, okay? You are going to face the effects of what everyone else is doing if you don't participate. Whether you participate or not participate, you're being forced to participate. So, that's where, the point that you make about the idea is like, okay, I'm one person. I don't have the $1 trillion companies or the billions that Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk has. my impact is not that important. But to that, I say there are three types of votes that each one of us and since we are on the topic of technology, we can keep it to technology, but this applies really to most things. In the technology world, if you have access, again, the people who have access to technology, because there's a whole other subset of population who is just being dragged along and they don't even participate because of so many other reasons. But if you're part of the technology ecosystem, either you're using it or you're creating it or you're creating policies around it, the three types of votes are, the first vote is the kind that you and I call the ballot, the usual vote. You go to the ballot box and you vote for politicians and individuals that are going to go and make policies in line with your values. So if you are able to vote, just vote. And sometimes people say, well, my vote doesn't count because we've created the us versus them. We've created that the government is terrible. It's like terrible people over there. Whatever, I do doesn't make change over there. But the reality is, if anything, we've seen in the past 8 years, just a vote can get someone in there and someone can do a lot of harm in a short amount of time. The second type of vote is voting with your wallet. So all of us wake up every day, we go either make money or spend money. And whatever you spend money, you're basically voting and that's your ballot right there. You're telling whoever's creating the thing that they're creating that make more of this. The good example is like the pornography industry. When people watch pornography, basically they're informing the creators that make more of this, right? So whatever action you're taking, you are informing the other person to make more of whatever the thing is. To vote with your dollars, whatever you spend your dollars, whatever you have your retirement accounts, whatever you have your investments, just understand the impact they're having on the world. And the third vote is the newest mining ground, and that's voting with your attention. And that has been commoditized, and people are making trillions of dollars off your attention. You may be like, yeah, I just watched the ad, or I just watched this news article. If you watch a video, the amount of time to the second, to the T, they know how long you spent on it. Did you click it? Did you share it? And if you inform the algorithm that you like this, then they show you more of that, which tells the other person who's creating the content to create more of that. So each one of us who is in the technology world, we have at least an access to one of those three. You may not have money, but you're watching things on social media. So it's that, using your votes to shift the narrative. You may feel like it's not doing much, but it is behind the screens.
I think that's fascinating. And one of the things we have talked about a lot in this series is this whole question of social change. And a couple of themes that I think are really interesting have emerged, at least in my mind, which is, and I'll use the case of the climate, right? And Marcus Erickson, who was with me last week, gives this example. So this is an example that he found. You remember years ago, there was this hysteria about the hole in the ozone, right? That there was a hole in the ozone layer that protected you from cancer-causing rays from the sun, and everybody should wear sun hats and lather on cream. But what was fascinating to me about the hole in the ozone story was it had a villain. Back to your notion of the narrative arc, right? There was a villain, and the villain was our carbon and fluorocarbons, CFCs. And what happened was there was such a groundswell of concern that people banned the use of CFCs, and guess what? A hole in the ozone layer closed. And so I think you're very smart to look at this idea of a narrative as something that can unite people behind certain simple things. And I love the way you talk about the climate, as breaking it down into specific issues that we could each get focused on, and possibly have a small impact.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good example. The hole in the ozone, it's like there was a lot of marketing and storytelling that went around it to create the shift in behavior. And even with the current storytelling around climate change, is terrible. It is terrible. There needs to be a new market. Like whoever did the marketing for coronavirus needs to do the marketing for climate change, because the story on the climate change is so removed from the day-to-day actions of the people that, the way things, so a flood happening in New York, a fire happening here in California, is like the actions of yesterday causes the effect of today, right? So there's the accountability, there's a gap between when the thing happens and when the terrible action happens. And the things we're doing today, the reaction to that is going to happen in the future. So it's very hard to hold people accountable. And also because it's in the future, like 100 years from now, the world will be on fire. Well, I'll be dead. So I don't really care. So being able to bring a sense of urgency is what the story needs to get at. And we haven't done a good job yet.
And who would that fall to, in your view?
The person who to tell the story.
Yeah.
I mean, the stories are told by the victor. So if there was a war and the war is, one side got decimated, destroyed, and then the other side won, the side that won is the one that has the printing press, right? They'll come back and write the book about how wonderful they did and how the story, how the war was wonderful, and because of their power, they were able to overcome this enemy. But we don't have the enemy to tell us their side of the story, because they don't have the soundboard. So I think right now, the person who owns the printing press, whatever the printing press is, like the media, the newspapers, the television, happens to be the people who are benefiting the most from the current ecosystem. So up until there's some form of them realizing, so there's that realization, and that realization is going to come either through a thorn or incentive. So let me explain. A thorn is when there's something in their rib so painful that they just can't ignore. Again, the powers that have the printing press and they control the printing press, they need to have a thorn in their rib, and the thorn could be, their mansion on top of a hill getting swept up by a tornado or something, right? Something that's painful, and then they react to that pain and want to change the narrative and then tell a better story. Or incentive, which is making $1 trillion not as sexy anymore. You know what's really sexy? Planting 1 trillion trees. So if we are to shift the incentive structure from the one side that's creating the chaos to another side that could make it better, and they see the value there, then they could change the narrative.
That's fascinating. So a story that this reminds me of is when you look at the supply chains for clothing, and some years back, there was a huge dust up about the essentially slavery and sweatshop conditions in a lot of the clothing supply chains, when you really went back and looked at who was actually, sewing the zippers on a Nike outfit. And it caused that whole sector to introduce reforms, to the working conditions. It caused them to want to be certified as, providing safe employment or so forth. But I think the other thing that is interesting about that example is, again, you've got a kind of a villain that you can point to, and you can say, employing children in sweatshop conditions is not good, and we're not going to support you. And so the public relations disaster was so bad that it really motivated companies. So I think maybe that's an example of a change, of a thorn. That would be an example of a thorn, not necessarily a change in incentives.
Yeah. It's a thorn or value. That's how the powers might be. The ones who have the chessboard and moving the chess pieces are going to respond.
So are you optimistic? So where do you kind of think we are at the moment in trying to tackle some of these? Because the issues you talk about in the book are huge. You could write an entire book about
each chapter
and truth. Yeah, you really could. Things like deep fakes, and misinformation. Trust. One of the biggest topics of conversation, at least among folks that I talk to in the context of the response to COVID, has been so much of it is a lack of trust. And so if you compare the response to this human scourge to, say, smallpox or polio or whatever, there used to be a lot more trust. People believed it when the scientist said something, and they believed it when the newscaster said, here's the way out of this. And now there's so little trust, and it just seems to be very fragmented. So I don't know. So where do you think we are in this sort of taking steps to counter some of these unintended, not just unintended, but I think you also have a strong theme in the book about some of them we didn't see and that just took us by surprise, but a lot of them we see and we just don't want to take in what it really means. So it's disbelief or disinformation about things.
Yeah, it's a good question. So before I talk about optimism or the case for optimism, I'll talk a little bit about trust. Trust is, we trust people that, so the word trust, I think, can be translated into the ability to predict the other person's action or the other thing's actions. So trust, in order for me to trust you, you must show me some form of repeatable pattern that you can be trusted. And sometimes you could show me repeatable patterns that you're not trusted, but then I trust that I will not get trust from you, right? So because that's the case, so there's the idea that, I would trust a scientist or I would trust the news. And then someone else who would not trust the scientist or not trust the news because someone else they trust told them that's not trusted. Okay. So because we live in these information bubbles, in the past, it was like your local pastor or your local elder, and it was very hard to scale. The person that people trusted was like very centralized. And most people had access to that person. And then your parents or some other people you trust will tell you that's a trusted person. And then you follow and you kind of see their behavior and you also trust them. But now we've gone from the individual and in the old analog world where it was hard to scale to like people trusting 80 million people trusting somebody's click on a button. And that has kind of created these big waves of swaying from one direction to another. So we need, as a society and a human species, need to understand that it is a complex system that we won't be able to have a universal trust in this fast way of disseminating information. But also understanding that the word trust has been diluted so much that it means different things for people today. So we may have to come up with a new definition. But anyway, so for the case for optimism, I'm a person who is a product of someone else's generosity. I would not be here if I was not an optimistic person. I'm very optimistic about most things in life. And every time I'm pushed in a corner, in fact, that's the one thing that I can know for sure that I rely on to find the light to take me to that next place that I need to be or go. So I believe in the goodness of humanity, that at some point we will come to a realization that the way the world is designed today needs reimagining that in a way that works for everybody. That's the optimistic person in me. However, I want to say that the issues we're seeing today, they're so unprecedented. Like we've never seen such a thing like this before, to a point that some of these things you have to push yourself from a 30,000 foot and look down to kind of see what's going on a macro scale, that you could have all the trust in the world, you could have all the optimism in the world, and we all kind of end up, slowly marching ourselves to the edge. And I can't do anything about that. I will stay optimistic all the way to the falling off the edge, but I can't do much about that. So that's kind of where I'm standing and where I'm at. And I also noticed someone in the chat asked, like, how do I measure success in my life? A few years ago, I did a lot of internal work to understand, okay, what is it that I'm here for? Why am I here? Why am I even here? Right? And a lot of times people, you wake up, you're working paycheck to paycheck, you're paying the bills, you're buying stuff, you don't have time to enjoy or buy a TV or a car, you don't have time to sit in it because you're busy making money so you can buy stuff, and you go through this cycle over and over and over again. And then you ask yourself, like, why am I even here? And for me, it came down to this: to make a difference in one person's life every single day. That's how I measure success. And I don't go around with a pen and paper. I'm like, oh, today was 3. It's just like I go about my day trying to share through words or actions or products that I've created to reach out and share with the world. And hopefully one person can be impacted in a positive light. And that's all I go for. And if I'm able to reach 1 million, 10 million, fantastic. That's a better world. That's a better day. But one person at a day. And the reason I break it down to one person is the idea that it is achievable and it is less daunting. Looking at like climate change, oh my God, what can I do about this? Or I'll just plant 1 tree. How about that? So anyways, that's how I measure success.
I think that's brilliant. That's really inspiring. And that is something that each of us can influence. Well, we're just about at time. So I want to thank you so much for joining us. And if I can be helpful, how can people help? So, you've got the book, so they can get the book. I'll just put that up again, Unintended Consequences of Technology. You've got your organization. What can people do to participate, to improve things?
No, I mean, so every year we have a conference, a UCOT conference. So you can show up in every part of the world, we put it. It's mostly in California most of the time. You can grab a book. It's everywhere books are sold. And just not to feel defeated, and really figure out how you can participate. And whatever small thing, it may feel small in your world, but imagine if every person on the planet did that, something small. That's 7 billion actions that will have a significant impact. And as humans, we tend to look at ourselves as so small and then look at what we've done in the impact of the world on our world. So we have such a small presence, but a very outsized impact. And I think it can happen in a positive realm too.
That's brilliant. That is just brilliant. Well, thank you so much for spending an hour with us, and to be continued, I hope.
Thank you so much, Rita, for having me. I appreciate you very much.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody. Have a great festive season, those of you, whatever it is you're celebrating, and we'll see each other in the new year. Thanks very much.